Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, FTA members. Welcome to this first Brexit webinar from the Freight Transport Association for 2017. My name is James Hookham. I'm FTA's Deputy Chief Executive, and I'll be hosting and part presenting this webinar. I'll be joined by my colleague Pauline Bastidon, our Head of European Policy, who will be joining us from Brussels. And will be contributing to the presentation. Now, this is the first of our monthly webinars, and there's been quite a lot of developments since the final one of 2016. So our objectives for the next 30 minutes or so are to review the various announcements and developments that have happened over the course of Christmas and the New Year on a political level. FTA has been busy, and we'll update you on some of our activities in respect of presenting members' needs and interests to government and other institutions, and a general update and roundup of developments under the various headings that we're following the Brexit debate on. And for those of you that regularly attend these webinars, you'll be familiar with our ABC guide to Brexit. So we'll give you an update on each of the topical issues that have been happening there. So I go to the agenda. We'll do a quick review of where we are with the process overall and the high level political activity, and then we'll take a look at the individual issues that we feel are worthy of your attention and where we think they have most impact on logistics, and then invite your questions at the end through the normal channels. Now, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, you're very welcome. Can I just remind you of the house rules that we use for these webinars? To avoid interference and feedback, please keep your microphone or telephone muted throughout the webinar. We are recording the proceedings, and that means that it will be available for download and subsequent review from the FTA website. And although we will be happy to receive and, if possible, answer your policy questions about what we're talking about, unfortunately we won't be able to deal live with any technical issues that you may have with the broadcast quality and reception issues. But we hope that nevertheless the value you get from this webinar is not impaired. Now, if you have a question, please use the chat box that is presented to you as part of the webinar software interface. We will attempt to answer as many of those as we can in the course of the webinar in the time allowed. But we'll get back to you with answers to your unanswered questions, and we will be able to view those on the FTA website in due course. So let's have a look at where we are. The decision, obviously, to leave the European Union, which was taken on the 23rd of June last year in the referendum, and it's perhaps an understatement, is going to have a major effect on all segments of the FTA membership in one way or another. We have produced our ABC guide to Brexit, which we'll be reviewing in just a moment. And this sets out all of the main areas of concern and impact that we foresee, and under which we are tracking and monitoring developments in order to identify issues for members early, and start to feed back and influence the debate and the negotiations that the government will soon be embarking upon. Now, these webinars are being organised on a monthly basis in order to keep members up to date with the very latest developments as we become aware of them. And we are expecting to be running these on a monthly basis throughout 2017. And previous webinars can be viewed on the FTA website. And though clearly some of the developments will have been overtaken by events, the discussion of the specialist topics on each of those webinars are still relevant and worthy of review. So that's the agenda and the pattern for today. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Pauline Bastidon in Brussels, to start the formal proceedings. Over to you, Pauline.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you through some of the recent developments that have been taking place. But first of all, what can we expect next? So there are many unknowns, but some certainties nonetheless. In terms of the things we do not know, of course, one of the important elements is the uncertainty surrounding the political landscape in other EU member states. So there are elections planned in the coming months in the Netherlands, in France, and later on in Germany as well. And many in Brussels are now saying openly that detailed negotiations could actually be postponed until these elections have happened. In any case, even if the discussions were to start before that, for sure there are certain uncertainties regarding the position that the new leaders could take, especially if there are changes in terms of majorities and that kind of things, which is particularly likely in France, for instance. The sequencing of negotiations is also something on which we'll get some more clarity in the coming months, but which is not very clear at this point. What we do know is that there will be two different sets of negotiations. One on the withdrawal process per se, so that's the process whereby we leave the EU, agreement on budgetary issues, the status of civil servants, what happens to the EU agencies that are located in the UK, for instance. And the second thing will be the future relationship with the EU post-Brexit, around the issues of trade, transport, or access to non-UK EU workers, for instance. Now, these two processes could take place in a parallel way or one after the other. But they will, in any case, most probably have to be concluded on slightly different legal basis. For instance, a trade deal would probably require the approval of all the member states if it's a mixed trade deal, which is the most likely option. So the timing of negotiations is also something which is a bit uncertain at this point. It depends very much on when the UK can actually trigger Article 50 on changes in power in other EU capitals, as I mentioned. There will be, in principle, 2 years from the date when Article 50 gets triggered to negotiate. But, well, we need to factor in ratification in the European Parliament by the European Council, so effectively there might be a bit less than 2 years to do the actual negotiations. Will there be a hard or soft Brexit? What are the options on the table? What kind of degree of access can we expect? What kind of regulatory convergence? All of this is not decided yet and could change depending on how the negotiations go, of course, in the future. Although, as we will see later, there seems to be a certain balance towards a slightly harder Brexit. And finally, will there be transitional arrangements? For how long and what will be the nature? That's also something which is not fully clear at this point, but which hopefully will become clearer as things progress. There are things, however, that we do know, that nothing changes until the leaving agreement has been signed, so until the negotiations for the withdrawal agreement have been concluded, everything remains the same. The EU rules and regulations still remain in place, and so do penalties in case you don't respect these rules. So it's quite important to consider that until a withdrawal agreement has been signed and enters into force, everything remains pretty much the same from a practical point of view and a regulatory point of view. I'm now going to take you through the Article 50 process. So basically, this process will only start when Article 50 gets formally triggered by the Prime Minister. There are certain uncertainties regarding timing there, because we're waiting for the Supreme Court to issue its verdict in the Article 50 Brexit appeal case in the coming days. Formal ratification by the Parliament could potentially delay the process of triggering out Article 50, which is initially planned to take place before the end of March. It's also been reported that the Supreme Court may rule that the devolved UK government must be consulted on Brexit. And considering the recent events in Northern Ireland, well, this could also potentially delay the process. So we'll just have to wait and see. But what we can say is that if the timetable of end of March at the latest can be respected by the UK government, then one possible time when this could be done is at the European Council meeting on the 9th and 10th of March. Once Article 50 has been triggered by the UK, then the European Council, of course, without the UK, needs to agree the guidelines for how the EU negotiations will be conducted, who will be negotiating on behalf of the EU, how this is going to happen in practice, but also possibly decide whether the discussions on the future relationship can take place in parallel. Then there will be, as I said, a 2-year period to negotiate the withdrawal agreement. The future relationship might or might not be decided at this stage. That's something that the Council will have to reveal when they publish their guidelines. If a deal is reached after this negotiation period, then the UK leaves and new arrangements would apply, or potentially, depending on how this has been decided, discussions on the future relationship could start at that point. If no deal is reached, then the negotiations could be extended, but that requires unanimous approval from all the other member states in the EU. If no deal is reached, no extension is secured, and this 2-year period has elapsed, then the EU treaties just cease to apply in the UK. In trade terms, what that means is that WTO rules would probably apply at least until the UK has negotiated a free trade agreement. So this is the process. I'm now going to introduce you to the key people from the European side and what are their roles and responsibilities. So of course there are 3 main institutions at European level: the European Council, the European Commission and the European Parliament, and all will have a role to play in the negotiations and the process. So the European Council will be responsible for setting out the guidelines for the negotiations, deciding in a practical way how these negotiations are going to take place and who's going to be in charge from the EU side. They can delegate the detail of negotiations to the European Commission. They don't have to, but this is widely expected. And they will have to approve the agreement with the UK with a qualified majority voting by the end of the process for it to become valid. So quite an important role with the European Council, Donald Tusk being currently its president. The European Commission has less of a formal role in the treaties when it comes to Article 50, but they have, generally speaking, a big role in trade negotiations. What we can say is that the Commission has established an internal task force, which is led by the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. You can see his picture on the slide. The task force is expanding gradually, so they have over 20 people who are actually advising Michel Barnier at this point in time. They are likely to lead the detail of negotiations, in particular when it comes to the withdrawal agreement. Now the services of the Commission, i.e. the officials that usually work in all the various DGs, which are like ministries if you want, these services are going to provide technical expertise and are likely to lead on trade negotiations for the future relationship between the EU and the UK. But this role will be much clearer once the Council, has issued its guidelines for the negotiations. The European Parliament also has an important role in this process because it needs to provide its consent before the Council can actually conclude the agreement with the UK. So from that point of view, they could very well decide to block the discussions or put political pressure on the other institutions to go in one direction or the other, so it should not be neglected in this process. Guy Verhofstadt is going to be the sort of lead coordinator from the European Parliament side on these Brexit negotiations, And again, you can see his picture on that slide. So with that, I'm going to hand over again to James for a brief introduction to the ABC Guide to Brexit.
Thank you, Pauline. So when FTA was confronted by the tangle of spaghetti that was Brexit, we started to try to set out what was the individual issues that might most affect members. And when we started to write them down and look at them, they very elegantly started to fall into an alphabetical list, which is the list you're looking at, which covers the principal areas and issues involved in the Brexit negotiations and debates that we believe are going to be affecting freight transport, logistics, and in particular international supply chains. Clearly at the top of the list, and by wonderful coincidence beginning with the letter A, is the whole issue of access to the single market, perhaps the most overused phrase in the whole of the Brexit debate so far. We will be saying a little bit more about that in some detail in just a moment, but the outcome of those negotiations to decide what access the UK has to the remaining single market is actually key to determining a lot of the other issues that are on this list. Not least, for example, the issue about what happens at the UK borders and the need for customs controls at those borders. We'll say a little bit more in detail about that in just a moment as well. And if there are customs controls, what exactly will be required in terms of duty payments, trade procedures, documentation, and other administration that exporters and importers and their forwarders and carriers will be expected to provide in order for goods to cross national borders in future. Quite apart from the international scene, there are clearly huge potential implications for the way that logistics is regulated and controlled within this country, not least the prospect of being freed from the requirements to adhere to European directives. What degree of freedom does that give the UK Parliament to start to set its own and possibly different requirements of transport shippers and operators that may differ from those in the rest of the EU? And given there may be a different set of regulations, what kind of enforcement regime might UK carriers and UK shipments expect once they move outside of the UK onto the continental market? And the issue of enforcement, particularly on British trucks and trailers that are abroad, is considered to be an important enough issue to warrant its own heading, that of enforcement, on this list. Now, we will be looking in more details at all of those headings, those first 5 headings, in just a moment, together with a little bit more exploration of the issues and developments around the letter N, N for non-UK workers. But before we go into that detail, let me just give you a little bit more update on some of the other issues that are on there. On the ABC Guide, F is for fuel duty, largely because at the time of the referendum result back in the summer, there was a lot of talk about the need for emergency budgets and the need for the government to recover some of the money that it foresee might be lost because of a vote for Brexit. And therefore we included on our list of issues the prospect of an increase in fuel duty, which is often used and has been used in the past as an easy way of raising cash very quickly for a cash-strapped government. Now, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, very nobly and in our view correctly, cancelled the planned increase in fuel duty that was planned for 2017 in his autumn statement that took place just before Christmas. But the Chancellor is back in the House of Commons on the 8th of March, and although he'll have a lot of other things that he needs to talk about, we are still very wary of the fact that he might still turn to fuel duty as a way of helping him balance his books. So FTA's submission to the Chancellor ahead of his budget in March will, as usual, focus heavily on the need not to increase fuel duty, and indeed we continue to argue for the benefits and merits of the broader economy of a further reduction in fuel duty because of the extra cash that it does put back into the economy. We achieved what we believe to be an important recognition of the significance of logistics in a future UK economy outside the European Union, with the announcement by the Secretary of State for Transport about the government's decision to back expansion at Heathrow Airport rather than any of the other options it was presented with. And the principal reasons that the government gave at the time for backing the Heathrow option was the need to maintain a freight cargo hub in the UK that could of course help British exporters and importers connect with their markets in other parts of the world. We believe that was largely due to the influence that FTA had on the debate and on the report of the Independent Airports Commission. So we are continuing to monitoring this development closely, and the next milestone on taking forward that decision to expand Heathrow will be the publication of a national policy statement, possibly before March, in which it will set out the government's plans on how the expansion at Heathrow will actually be carried forward, together with a formal timeline as to when planning permission and other matters will be sought and other debates will be had. I is for Ireland. You can't have failed to have noticed the very significant political developments in Northern Ireland over the past few days, with the probability of new elections there, with the resignation of the Deputy First Minister. FTA is very conscious of the impacts of Brexit on trade and logistics on the island of Ireland, and our members in Northern Ireland are very concerned and expressing grave reservations about the re-implementation of a formal border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Likewise, members of FTA Ireland in the south are equally concerned about not just about continued open access to the Northern Ireland markets, where a lot of them have connections, but obviously their fear of being isolated on the wrong side of the United Kingdom when it comes out of the European Union, and needing effectively to exit the European Union when they leave Ireland, transit through the United Kingdom, which will be out of the EU, and then re-enter the European Union when they cross the Dover Straits to get into France or into Belgium. So major concerns about Irish-based businesses about how they will continue to land bridge through the UK in the future. So Ireland gets its own letter on our ABC guide. A lot of British businesses have big interests in Ireland, and we are monitoring closely the impact over there. J is a little bit of self-promotion. J is for joining in the Brexit debate with the FTA, and we'll bring you up to date on some of the other activities exclusively available to FTA members that we are planning for later in this half of the year towards the end of the seminar. We are also keeping a close eye on developments in Scotland. Whilst there is a lot of political rhetoric and talk from the First Minister in Scotland about reigniting the debate for independence of Scotland, there is no material developments there to speak of, but nevertheless FTA is acutely aware of the impact on logistics and national supply chains were there to be some kind of border between England and Scotland, and although we've not quite promoted it to being on the list formally, we've reserved the letter S on our ABC guide to probably be reserved for Scottish issues should Indy Ref 2, as it's referred to, actually materialise and the prospect of an independent Scotland re-emerge as a real possibility. So in trying to keep a tabs on all the myriads of developments and the intertwining of activities, this is our principal list of issues, and we will return to this list in future webinars and report developments against each of these headings in future. But as I said, we now want to take you through a selection of those and give you some detailed updates. So I'll now hand back to Pauline to take you through access to the single market. Pauline.
Thank you, James. So access to the single market, that's one of the most crucial issues that has been discussed and will be discussed during the next few months. So what will this EU-UK trading relationship be post-Brexit? Different models have been suggested, but now we have a little bit more clarity as to what government seems to be heading towards. And at this point in time, the UK's preferred option seems to be a specific free trade agreement that would be negotiated between the EU and the UK, not necessarily trying to model anything that already exists out there. So of course it's one of the hard Brexit options. What's at stake and would have to be negotiated as part of this agreement is what are the arrangements for the future trade relationship with the EU, including the procedures. What's the degree of access that UK companies will get to the EU single market? And that's both for manufacturers, retailers, but also those providing logistics and transport services. And what's the degree of regulatory convergence? Of course, we know that there will be a lot of regulatory convergence on the day of Brexit, but what happens afterwards? The default option, of course, will be trade under WTO rules, i.e. no preferential access, which does not mean that trade will not be possible. It's just that it will be slightly more difficult as there will be tariffs in place as well as non-tariff barriers. If we now go to borders, the issue of juxtaposed controls around Calais is something that was quite a hot topic before Christmas. There were calls by major French politicians to actually repatriate the border. This has now sort of stopped, or paused at least, for a while. But of course the upcoming elections in France could change this. So this is something we're going to monitor quite closely in the coming months. The restricted space in the UK means that service frequency could be limited if that were to happen. So this is something we wish to avoid. We're also looking at the potential delays that could result from customs checks and could have a similar negative impact, in fact, on trade between the UK and the rest of the continent. We're going to be modeling the costs and the impact that this could have, and we'll report on this when we have results of this modeling exercise. For customs, I'm going to hand over to James again.
Well, C is for customs, and it is in the customs arrangements and the duties and the trade procedures at the border in which the real consequences of hard or soft Brexit actually play out. Hard or soft Brexit or the degree of access that UK companies have to the European market manifests itself in the severity and the degree in which customs controls are imposed at the border. Clearly, with our current membership of the European Union, the customs controls are minimal, and there's virtually no goods on which duty tariffs are actually charged. The whole debate around hard or soft Brexit is the extent to which customs controls are reimposed on goods moving into and out of the UK. So this is an absolutely crucial issue for the competitiveness of the UK economy and continued degree of flexibility and ease with which British companies can trade with their customers on the continent, and it has knock-on implications into the complexity of trade with existing and indeed with new overseas markets outside Europe. So the customs duties, the documentation procedures, the licensing, etc., all has an on-cost which dictate the competitiveness of British goods in foreign markets. The much hoped for free trade agreements that the UK will strike with other countries once it's free of the European Union are all about reducing the automatic tariffs and non-tariff barriers that are introduced if we fall back to the default arrangements, which are the rules under the World Trade Organization. So they are about reducing those custom tariffs that are set as the default. The issue around whether the UK remains a member of the European Customs Union is all about the trade-off between the ease of access to the European market and the ability of the UK to strike its own free trade agreements with markets outside the European Union. At the moment, being a member of the EU, the UK has to be party to whatever collective deals the European Union strikes and is unable to strike deals on its own at the moment. And it will be continuing to be restricted in whether it can strike those deals if it remains in the European Customs Union. So there are a whole load of permutations here of the different types of relationship that the UK might have in future with the European Union, and each one of those has a different set of customs arrangements that would then prevail as a consequence of the particular kind of relationship that the UK has. FTA has commissioned work to try to understand exactly what kind of customs procedures would prevail under what kind of relationship, and we will be hoping to report that a little bit later in the year. So, for example, we're trying to understand what would be the arrangements that would prevail if the UK remained in the customs union but outside of the European Union itself. And a second scenario that we might model is, okay, so that Britain comes out of the customs union but remains a member of what is known as the European Economic Area. That it will require a different set of customs arrangements, and it's important that we understand what they may be so we can evaluate the impact and inform members as to what they would have to do. So a whole range of different scenarios will be modelled and tested, and we would be hoping to report those in a few months' time. In addition, whatever deal is finally struck with the European Union, and indeed whatever free trade deals are struck with other countries, other trading nations, FTA will be ensuring that those trade deals are not imposing undue burdens on shippers of goods, and we'll be testing each new deal to make sure that it is shipper friendly. So our customs agenda is a very substantial one in helping to continue to allow British companies to deal easily with customers abroad, and to ensure that trade doesn't get stifled by the imposition of new red tape and administrative burdens because of the need to observe new customs arrangements. D is for domestic legislation on our ABC guide, probably of the greatest relevance to the most number of FTA members, and for any member that's operating assets or got operations within the UK. The big question is, will the current arrangements for regulation and licensing of transport in the UK continue, or does our leaving of the European Union mean that there is a wholesale reform of that legislation? Well, the government is quite unclear as to exactly what will happen once Britain leaves the European Union. The only, in this regard, the only statement that's been made was by the Prime Minister back in September, when she promised to introduce what she calls a Great Repeal Bill. This will be an act of the British Parliament that will take over ownership of all the legislation that has been made under European law since Britain joined the common market back in 1973. So it's a way of, if you like, taking back responsibility and ownership and sovereignty for all the previously made EU legislation. The government intends this to be a very simple, straightforward sort of cut and paste exercise where everything that was made under European law the day before we left the European Union simply gets copied across and pasted into a new Act of Parliament, which makes it the responsibility of the British Parliament. And the Prime Minister has then said that having done that, then in the fullness of time, the British Parliament will be given the opportunity to then decide which bits of European legislation it will keep, it will change, or it will do away with altogether. Now, the extent to which we can repeal bits of legislation and be selective about which bits of European legislation we continue to enact in the UK very much depends upon the outcome of the negotiations over the degree of access to the single market. So the two are inextricably linked. So, for example, if we end up looking like Norway, which is outside the European Union, it's outside the customs union, but is a member of the European Economic Area, part of that deal, which gives Norway access to the European single market, is that Norway, by and large, continues to enact all European directives. If the UK ends up looking like that, then the scope for change of the domestic legislation will be quite limited. If, on the other hand, we are a completely freestanding, independent entity doing deals with the other trading blocs under the World Trade Organization rules, then the British Parliament pretty much has free license to scrap, change or keep whatever legislation that it wants. So although this great reform bill will be presented to Parliament before the country actually leaves the European Union, what happens to the legislation afterwards very much depends upon the outcomes of the negotiations. So we really do have to wait to see what happens on domestic legislation until we've worked out what's going to be happening to our international relationships. And before everyone gets too excited about the prospects of scrapping EU driver's hours rules or doing away completely with the driver CPC directive, some international rules are already introduced in the UK and imposed in the UK under non-EU legislation. And it may come as a surprise to learn that actually the driver's hours rules themselves are embodied in a different set of international agreements, which sits to one side of the European Union and will probably remain in force anyway. They wouldn't automatically come up for consideration simply because they are implemented by a different means. In whatever event, FTA will remain close to this topic because clearly it could have potentially huge impact on members. We have already started to identify legislation that we might want to try to influence and change if the opportunity presents itself. But members of FTA's national and regional trade councils will be given the full opportunity to influence that agenda as and when it becomes available to us. So rest assured that although it may be for some time yet, this will be a key part of FTA's contribution to the Brexit debate as and when the opportunity is available. Just for information, if you wish to review some of the things that we've been thinking about, please check out the December webinar, which you will find accessible on the FTA website and indeed on YouTube, where there was an analysis given of some of the legislation that early analysis suggests might be reviewed and considered, or FTA members might want reviewed and considered, based on some very informal soundings that we took during the autumn period. Back to Pauline for issues around enforcement.
Thank you. So E is for enforcement. And why is this here? Well, recently we've seen, especially with road transport, that there's a much greater scope for local enforcement of rules on non-EU trucks, especially with the emergence of minimum wage rules that are all slightly different, with slightly different requirements in Germany, in France, Italy, or Austria, to name the latest. Obviously, at this point in time, we can always go to the Commission and complain that this is neither fair for the industry, not in line with EU rules, and sometimes they react positively. So they've decided to start an infringement procedure against France and Germany, for instance, on this minimum wage issue. Obviously, once we've left the European Union, we will not be in a position to appeal to Brussels after Brexit or to the European Commission. It will be much more difficult as the UK industry. Requirements for drivers, vehicles, loads, all of this will have to be settled in the new deal for access to the single market or through bilateral deals with each member state, which is still the case for several countries not members of the EU but on the outskirts of the EU, which of course would be quite cumbersome. So, you know, something else to consider in the coming months. Non-UK EU workers, that's another very important issue for us, because we do know that this is going to be potentially one of the red lines for the UK government. The status of EU citizens that are already working in the UK is a different matter, but it's still undecided as well. This might well be subject to the UK-EU negotiations as well. And it's going to be a major issue for the whole of the UK industry, in fact, for all kinds of sectors, not just transport and logistics. We are going to make the case for freight transport because logistics relies heavily on non-UK EU workers. We published quite recently a report that outlined that about 10% of the drivers in the UK are non-UK EU workers, and about 20% of staff that work in warehouses are non-UK EU workers. So it's obviously critical for industry to get some clarity on this matter and be able to retain access to the best skills wherever they come from. So that's going to be a priority for us, and we had a webinar a couple of months ago which focused specifically on the issue of skills and access to non-UK EU workers. So I would encourage you to go back to that webinar for more information. So to sum it up, what are the practical implications of Brexit? Short term, until the UK actually leaves the EU, as I said, expect no radical changes. All the EU rules, all the regulations continue to apply. Penalties are still there. Of course, the pound fluctuations have already had some impact, pretty drastic impact in some cases, be it positive or negative, and that might continue as negotiations usually come with a certain degree of uncertainty, unfortunately. Post-Brexit, the extent of changes depends very much on what the UK deal with the EU will look like. Obviously, we want to make sure that trade remains as simple as possible and can continue in the best possible way, both with the EU and with third countries. And that will be a priority for FTA in this process. I'm now going to hand over to James on what FTA is doing and will be doing in the coming weeks.
Well, we're clearly in a period of time when FTA, together with just about everybody else in the country, is waiting for the government to declare its hand, to give some kind of purpose and vision and direction to these negotiations. So we are all in great anticipation of the Prime Minister's speech, which is due to be given on Tuesday, in which she's promised that she will give some further indication as to the strategy that the government is pursuing in the course of Brexit. Until then, we have been attempting to anticipate what those issues are and start to make sure that ministers, secretaries of state and their civil servants, who are of course hugely distracted and frankly overwhelmed by this quite unexpected need to attend to a deal with Brexit, don't forget that efficient freight transport and the need to get the country's goods to market are an absolutely crucial activity and must not be overlooked despite all the other political issues and pressures that are crowding in on them. The Chief Executive of FTA, David Wells, has had face-to-face and very constructive meetings in the past few weeks with the Secretary of State for Transport, Chris Grayling, and in particular with Lord Bridges of Headley, who is a junior minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union. Lord Bridges asked a lot of questions, expressed a lot of interest in detailed aspects of international trade. To be honest, surprised us by his knowledge and awareness of some of the problems and issues that might arise. And FTA is supplying the Department for Exiting the EU with some detailed advice and understanding on some of the customs and related issues which you've been hearing about earlier. Meanwhile, back in Brussels, Pauline and her team are stepping up engagement with all the institutions there. You saw the analysis of the roles that the Commission, the Parliament and the European Council are playing. And FTA is taking a general approach that it will continue to influence all EU legislation that threatens or affects FTA members whilst we still can. And even though it might be debatable as to whether or not the proposals that the Commission is now starting to think about will affect British companies once we're outside the EU, our stance has been to continue to exercise our rights to attend the meetings, to influence the outcomes and attempt to get the best deal possible for FTA members' interests. And in particular, we're watching very closely the package of changes that are being proposed to a number of road transport directives that is currently going through the procedures. And the Commission is also suggesting that in the very near future it will be consulting upon changes to the driver CPC directive and also proposing extension of some of the O-licensing controls to vans and vehicles below the 3.5 tonne threshold. Clearly, if we were not leaving the European Union, they would be of huge impact and consequence to FTA members. And so, as I said, we are taking the view that we should continue to influence those as best we can, just in case we have to end up living with those proposals under the deal that is eventually done to give us access to the single market. This webinar is one of a number of information channels through which we are continuing to communicate with members. All of our regular communication channels are carrying Brexit information, and there are some blogs available on the website where FTA staff are reflecting in some greater detail on some of the issues that you've been hearing today. But we have announced this week our first major conference on Brexit that will be taking place in March, and I'll just give a few more details of that in just a moment. So have your diaries ready, because if you're involved in international trade, I'm sure this will be an event that you'll be interested in. Elsewhere, we are analysing and studying the rules and procedures that would apply to UK exports and imports under different trading scenarios. I was describing that work a little earlier. And as Pauline mentioned, an important question asked of us by the Department for Exiting the EU was if customs controls were imposed at the borders, what impact would that have on delays to international road freight movements? And based on our knowledge and our analysis of the impact of the Operation Stack crisis that we had down here in Kent a couple of summers ago, we have quite a body of information and data on which we're drawing to try to extrapolate that data and model it to answer the Minister's questions there. So that's a piece of work that we will share with members once we have completed it. But look, if you're interested in international trade and particularly what the impact of Brexit will be on customs procedures, please take note of our Keep Britain Trading Conference, which is taking place at the QE2 Conference Centre. That's directly opposite Westminster Abbey on Wednesday the 15th of March. Aimed at importers, exporters, forwarders and international hauliers, this is the event where we are going to try to analyse with a panel of experts and contributors exactly what FTA members might be needing to do in the future under these different Brexit scenarios that we've been discussing. We've invited the Minister. We're certainly going to be hearing from our partners at the University of Sussex, the UK Trade Policy Observatory, who are very knowledgeable about these different trade scenarios. We've also invited some of our counterparts in other trading nations to come and join us, either in person or possibly by video link, in order to reflect upon trading procedures and possible future trading patterns were new trade deals to be struck with countries such as Australia, Sri Lanka and Canada. If you go to the FTA website, fta.co.uk, there is a conference page there for you to be able to register for the event. So if you're involved in international trade and transport, we hope that this will be an important and significant way, not only in which you can contribute to the debate, you can get up to speed on all the latest issues, but also, given where it's being held, we will be inviting a lot of other stakeholders in the political community to come and join us, and it will probably be a golden opportunity for you to meet face to face some of the advisors to government that are actually formulating what the government should do in the Brexit debate. So I hope you can join us for that occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, we've given you a lot of information. I realise we've overrun our time slightly, but I hope you found that to be helpful. If you have any questions you want to ask us straight away, please do use the chat box on the webinar software interface, and we will stay online in order to deal with those as they come in. Any unanswered questions we will post up on the FTA website. But can I remind you that our next webinar is due to take place on Tuesday the 14th of February at 11:30 in the morning, and you can register for that event through the normal channels, through the website fta.co.uk/Brexit. I hope you found that helpful, and I hope you join us again on that occasion. Thank you for your attention. Can I wish you a good afternoon? Thank you.